So first to what we are dealing with, and I wanted to talk about this a little bit because the Trump administration is genuinely difficult, I think, to grapple with, particularly when we're dealing with a fire hose of constant news with an organised far right that is continually flooding the zone, as Trump architect Steve Bannon describes it, but also because the Trump phenomenon itself is somewhat contradictory. Trump himself is in many ways the logical, almost the logical conclusion of American history. He has capitalized so incredibly well on the deep fissures of American politics, on the racial, on the economic, on health fissures of American politics and American culture to come to power. He has weaponized, I think, American history in a way almost no one else has been able to do. And so we have to understand him as a product of American history and not at all an aberration, which I think we sometimes still think of him as, because he is so extraordinary and as an individual is so able to suck all the oxygen out of the room and to make it really difficult, I think, to think in longer term and to think structurally. And that is partly also because he is, as much as he is a logical conclusion of American history, he's also operating in very different circumstances to previous leaders. And because of those circumstances, is able to take things a lot further. He's able to take the anti-democratic tendencies of American political culture, which have always existed, arguably further than they've ever been taken before. And I think the other reason that Trump and the Trump phenomenon is so difficult to grapple with is because it is simultaneously ridiculous and dangerous. Trump himself is ridiculous. It's hard to take him seriously often, because what he does or what he says is so irrational and so contradictory. And, looking at the way, for example, he's bedazzled the Oval Office, has kind of made it resplendent in gold and engages in this particular kind of aesthetic, is ridiculous. The images of the National Guard patrolling the National Mall in DC, for example, for those of you who've ever been to that part of DC, you'll know how ridiculous it is. Like, it's one of the safest and calmest places in the United States, and to suggest that the National Mall is a hotbed of crime is ridiculous and goes against all evidence. But at the same time, the deployment of the National Guard is incredibly dangerous. Trump's weaponization of political violence is incredibly dangerous. His dismantling of the institutions and the structures and the principles of international law is incredibly dangerous. And both of those things are happening at once. So separating the signal from the noise, as one of my colleagues has put it, is incredibly difficult and exhausting, because it's something that we have to do all of the time. But what I would argue is that when we zoom out, what we are dealing with, what we are facing in the United States, is fascism. It is undeniably fascism. It's a particular kind of American fascism, but it's fascism nonetheless. And in understanding that the nature of that fascism, my go-to is an essay written 20 years ago this year by Umberto Eco, an Italian philosopher, called Fascism, which I can link if you like. But I think it's a beautiful way of understanding the particular kind of fascism that we are dealing with, and its inherent contradictions and its inherent dangers and risks. And Trump's fascism, I think, is often fairly obvious. He is, or attempts to be at least, the quintessential strongman. The guy who's dealing with Vladimir Putin, who is hypermasculine, who is engaged in demonstrations of strength and the weaponization of violence. Trump's fascism has a particular aesthetic. I talked about the gold in the White House, but it also has a particular cultural aesthetic. The all caps in the Truth Social posts, the NFTs, the particular symbolism that Trump uses of himself, the AI generated images of, a kind of extremely muscular strongman at war with enemies from within. These are all cultural products that are traded through the MAGA universe. And they are violent ones. They trade off political violence and they weaponize political violence. We've seen that play out just this week, where the shocking but not surprising assassination of the MAGA darling Charlie Kirk is being weaponized by the Trump administration. Trump is already talking about using that incidence of abhorrent but unfortunately incredibly common violence in the United States to go after his political enemies. They are talking about retribution. Trump is talking about now going after the organizations that he argues have allowed this violence to happen. And that has been a long project of Trumpism and the far right in the United States. So this is all being integrated into Trump's particularly fascist project. But for our purposes, I think it's worth focusing on the traditionalist nature of Trump's fascism and the way that it is anti-science and anti-expertise. And I think that irrationalism is often hard to grapple with. But I think that's where Umberto Eco is particularly useful, because he writes about this kind of fascism as part of a cult of tradition where there can be no advancement of learning. It is a total rejection of modernism. And we can see this again in the way that Trump speaks and in the kinds of policies he enacts. So he talks, even for example, when he's talking about tariffs and the imposition of tariffs, he talks about the United States pre-1919, when there was no income tax and we had this kind of economic utopia where America prospered and everything went downhill after that. Trump and Trumpism yearns for a kind of pre-war or immediately post-Second World War United States, where the single parent, the household was run by basically a father who could earn enough money to support a family, where a woman was in her rightful place at home and children were obedient. They yearn for this particular traditionalist, nostalgic version of the United States, one which never really existed, but has very potent political currency. and in this way, the Enlightenment, the Age of Reason, as Eco says it, is really the beginning of modern depravity. And so this irrationalism, I think, defines Trumpism. And again, to quote Eco, he writes that in modern culture, the scientific community praises disagreement as a way to improve knowledge. It's an essential part of the scientific project. But for this particular kind of fascism, disagreement is treason. So this is the framework in which Trumpism operates, and I think the framework that we really have to grapple with, we have to understand if we want to understand not only who Trump is and what he might do, but how we might respond. And I'm not sure that we're even at that point of, particularly in Australia, of understanding what this is and what we are dealing with and what American fascism might mean for Australia. And that's particularly true, I think, when it comes to the security implications of the Trump administration's attacks on public health, which aren't, they're getting attention in Australia, I think, in a sensationalist way. When the Secretary of the Department of Health, RFK Jr., goes before a Senate hearing, as he did last week, we kind of understand it in the sense of the celebrity of American political culture, but we don't necessarily understand the implications, I think, of what he is doing. Of course, you do, probably better than I do, but I don't think that we're integrating that into our understanding of what the Trump administration means for us. And so I think it's important to outline, who RFK Jr. is and what he is doing as the Secretary of the Department of Health and Human Services. And RFK Jr., again, a little bit like Trump, is a difficult one to understand. I actually saw him speak at a convention in DC before the election, before he had withdrawn from the race, and Trump had kind of integrated him into the universe. And he is a really strange phenomenon to grapple with. I think, he has the Kennedy looks, but very little of the Kennedy charm. He's a particularly wooden kind of speaker. Well, I experienced him as a wooden speaker, but he has managed to carve out this particular niche in Trump world and in the far right of American politics, where he gains a huge amount of support, or he gained a huge amount of support from Silicon Valley in particular, and the wealthy elite of that particular white subset, I think, of the American tech world, particularly women supported him, women who are deeply integrated into wellness culture and that kind of traditionalist tradwife strand of anti-vaxxers that exists on Instagram, gave him a huge amount of support, and that explains why Trump allowed him, I think, into his universe, because he brought that support and particularly that money, importantly, with him. So that's why I think Trump indulged him and gave him the Department of Health, which is what he wanted and what his supporters wanted. And he has gone on to do exactly what he said he would do. This is the thing about the Trump administration, is they tell us constantly who they are and what they are going to do. They provided a 900-page manifesto in the form of Project 2025 that said exactly what they would do, and they're going on to do it. And the key, I think, here, particularly for the Australian government, is actually listening to that and paying attention to what they say they're going to do, because they're going ahead and doing it. And, again, you would know better than I what RFK Jr. is doing in terms of public health. But, I think it's worth going into in a little bit of detail, because as early as February, less than a month really after Trump's inauguration, the department under RFK Jr. began freezing research grants in various public health areas. By late March, 780 grants from the National Institute of Health had been cut to 220 organisations. Just under half of those were universities. In May, the National Heart, Lung and Blood Institute guideline was updated to include vaccine hesitancy. COVID-19 became an additional target for funding cancellation. And by June, 1,700 grants for the National Institute of Health had been cancelled, and another 3,200 were being reviewed for possible termination. By August, the department had begun to wind down funding for mRNA vaccine development, including cancelling contracts, including contracts for research into the vaccine for avian flu. And of course, there will be, again, you will know this better than I, the flow-on effects from the cancellation of this kind of research are hard to quantify, but will be significant and will have significant implications for the spread of infectious diseases and for the treatment of diseases. By August, so fairly recently, the list of cancelled grants is now 52 pages long. It has about 1,800 entries. So this is a catastrophic erosion of the research, architecture and work in public health in the United States, which of course has global implications. And that's what I want to talk about a little bit now, because I think, we have a tendency, especially in Australia, to treat the domestic politics of the United States as almost entirely separate from what it does internationally. We will often speak about Australia's relationship with the United States as above presidents, as above prime ministers, as above politics, and try to draw like arbitrary boundaries between the domestic and the international. But I think nothing really demonstrates the futility of that more than public health and the catastrophic erosion of public health measures in the United States, because they have significant international implications. But just before I do that, I want to go back a little bit to the why of this, because again, it's hard to understand, I think, the irrationality of what is happening, because we can point to evidence that says, X million people will die as a result of these funding cuts, and dealing with the callousness that you get in response to that is quite difficult, with the irrational response to that. But I think it's worth understanding where RFK and Trumpism are coming from more broadly in this understanding. And that is a particular view of health and society that is ruthlessly individualistic. So in RFK Jr.'s framing, and of course this I'm paraphrasing, but I'm convinced that this is the ideological underpinnings of what RFK is doing. If you were to become ill, or even die as a result of these policies, as a result of the withdrawal of support and public health measures, then that is because of individual choice. That is because of your failings as an individual and because of individual weakness. And those who survive have done so because they are strong, because they have made good choices. So and that is really that, as callous and perhaps simplistic as that summary is, that's where that is coming from. And RFK has been fairly straightforward about this. So in April 2025, for example, he gave a television interview in which he said that people have a choice about how sick they are going to be. That this is a moral question and it's a philosophical question. So this, again, this is the approach that they take to public health. They don't see it as an investment in collective safety or collective security. They see it as individual choice. And this framing is not just confined, again, to the domestic, but is expanded internationally. And of course, this matters to us because these policies and the ideology that underpins them, again, aren't just confined to the domestic United States, but are projected out internationally. And the Trump administration has been actively doing this. Sandra, in her introduction, mentioned the cuts to USAID, the US Foreign Aid Fund, which has been totally dismantled, and illegally so. It's worth mentioning that the Trump administration has no legal authority to dismantle agencies like this. That can only be done legally by an act of Congress. But this is where those public health measures and Trump's anti-democratic project collide, because, of course, Trump doesn't care about legal or constitutional constraints on what he is doing, and it's becoming increasingly clear that the system is not able to withstand these kinds of attacks, because what the Trump administration is doing, to use a Silicon Valley phrase, is moving fast and breaking things. And when the Trump administration dismantles an agency like USAID, they do so illegally. And of course, then there are legal challenges. There are constant legal challenges to what Trump is doing, but they move so slowly that by the time they get through the system and, are often declared illegal, it's almost too late. The funding has already been withdrawn, the people and the expertise have already left, and there is no effort to rebuild those institutions or those agencies. So the legal pathway is proving too slow and too reactive to the Trump administration's attacks on institutions. And again, that is having significant domestic and international consequences. There are significant consequences. Many of you, I'm sure, will have seen that there was a study in the Lancet that was published in July 2025 around those cuts to USAID and the withdrawal of funding, suggesting that withdrawal could result in 14 million deaths across the world by 2030. That's just the mean estimate. So the possible range that study gave was between 8.5 million to 19.7 million deaths. And a significant number of those, of course, were children under 5. To take a more specific example, the UN warned in July that by 2029 there could be 6 million additional HIV infections and 4 million AIDS-related deaths attributable directly to cuts to US AID. So that's just one subset of the damage that we are talking about. And then, of course, on the first day of the Trump administration, Trump ordered the United States withdrawal from the World Health Organization. He'd attempted that in 2020, but it was reversed by the Biden administration in 2021. So again, this is another example of how the guardrails are completely gone in the second Trump administration. The United States, as many of you will no doubt be aware, was the largest single contributor to the World Health Organization, made up about 15% of its funding, but it also provided technical and administrative support. So again, the consequences of that withdrawal are significant, and that domestic and international flow comes back as well, because of course by withdrawing from the World Health Organization, the Trump administration and the United States more broadly loses access to that critical information provided by the World Health Organization in terms of the development of disease, the possible outbreaks of pandemics, and the research architecture that comes with that. So all of that, I think, is a long way of saying that, again, we have to understand what the Trump administration is doing domestically as directly related to what is happening internationally, that there aren't clear boundaries between Trump domestically and Trump internationally. We have to understand what he is doing at home in an international context, and we have to understand the ideology that drives him and his administration in ideological context as well. And I think in terms of the implications for us, and again, I'm sure I'm preaching to the converted here, I think we have to understand what the Trump administration is doing in terms of public health and democracy as a direct security threat to the rest of the world. What is a security threat if not the potential deaths of 14 million people as a direct result of Trump administration policies? And I think if you take that in the context as well, and I don't have time to go into this, but we can talk about it if we want, if we take it in the context of the Trump administration's attacks on climate action and climate mitigation policies, again, domestically and internationally, I think we can see that as a direct security threat to the world. Climate change is a security threat to the world, and it's particularly a security threat to our region, to the Pacific, and to Australian security. So, and again, as you would know, the intersections between climate and public health are significant, and these withdrawals and failures and attacks compound each other. Excuse me. And then this is all, of course, happening as well in the context of the Trump administration's deliberate dismantling of the structures and the principles of international law. This is an administration that has directly threatened to annex and even take over its traditional allies in Canada and in Greenland. This is a Trump administration that has given almost blanket permission to the Russian government and the Israeli government to consolidate their territorial claims in Ukraine and in Palestine, to take territory by force, and with no consequences. Just in the last week or two, the Putin regime has made incursions into Polish and Romanian airspace that has been met with a shrug, effectively, from the Trump administration. So all of these attacks on international security are happening at once and compounding each other, which means the picture is pretty grim. I talk a lot about the Trump administration, and it can be very hard to find hope and to find optimism, because genuinely the picture is so grim, and Trump is being met by so little coordinated resistance at home and abroad, arguably. But But that doesn't mean, of course, that there aren't options, and that the rest of the world doesn't have power or agency in the face of what the Trump administration is doing. And that really brings me, as I come to a close, to that question of, so what do we do? I think is a question that we're all asking ourselves constantly. How do we respond to the Trump administration? And I think we have to start, to go back to where I started, we have to start from this point of understanding what it is we are dealing with. That the Trump administration is not an aberration, that he is exactly who he tells us that he is, and that he will continue along this path. It is not the situation is not going to magically repair itself in the United States. The America that we thought we knew here in Australia is not coming back. And we do not share, I think from an Australian perspective, it's worth really emphasizing that we do not share values with the Trump administration. So often our relationship is framed, the relationship between Australia and the United States is framed as one of shared values. And I think it's worth saying unequivocally that if that were ever true, it has changed now, perhaps irrevocably. But that's not to say that we do not share values with broader America, with those people and organizations in the United States that do have an interest in the preservation and resurrection of American democracy. And I think that's where we should begin, with our shared interest in democracy and the rule of law that goes beyond our elected governments, but speaks to our deeper history and our deeper shared connections. And that's where I think Australia can play a significant role in bolstering support for democracy worldwide and supporting the structures and the institutions and the norms of international law. And I think that can come in the form of some concrete policies and some concrete action. So Australia already has, as many of you would know and many of you would have engaged in, significant cultural, political, institutional connections in the research space, in medical research and through universities in particular. Australian universities are deeply connected to and integrated with American universities, often through people-to-people contacts. And I think Australia can play a significant role in bolstering support for the kind of research that the Trump administration is so catastrophically undermining, and bolstering support for our colleagues in the United States who are under attack by the Trump administration, not just in terms of their research work and their research funding, but in terms of their individual careers and the individual work that they do. Australia can bolster those connections, can support them institutionally and through funding, and help them to play the critical role that they do need to play in American democracy and in Australian democracy as well. Australia can also play a significant role in mitigating some of the direct threats that the Trump administration poses to Australia through climate action, for example. Australia is in a position to fill some of the space that has been left by the Trump administration in terms of climate action, particularly in our region. That would require a significant change in policy from the current Australian government, which has just gone to the Pacific Leaders Forum and promised climate action, only to come back and approve a dramatic expansion to the Northwest gas shelf. But, that is not inevitable and that can change. And I think public pressure, particularly to improve the Australian government's positions and policies on climate action, could make a major contribution to regional security and, of course, regional public health. And I think the same can be true of health investment. The Australian government has, and state governments as well, have made significant investments in vaccine research. For example, I'm in Victoria, that's happened in Melbourne, and again, that can continue and particularly can be expanded regionally in, I think, a direct challenge to what the Trump administration is doing to public health and what I've just outlined the department there in the US is doing. And I think we often in Australia underestimate our power and our agency when it comes to those kinds of policies and those kinds of actions. Australia is the 12th largest economy in the world, comparable to the Russian economy, but we don't act as if we have that much power or that much agency, and particularly that much investment power. But we do. And we also have a significant amount of respect internationally that I'm sure you have encountered individually, but also institutionally and nationally. We have a lot of respect at agencies like the UN, for example, which is meeting just this week. And we can use that power and agency, I think, to, as I said, bolster the forces of international democracy and the structures of international law. But what that means, just to wrap up, is a much broader understanding of security and what it is that keeps us safe. I think historically in Australia, our relationship with the United States has led us to a poverty-stricken, really, understanding of security that assumes that security means the temporary absence of inevitable war. And to ensure that temporary absence, we have to align ourselves, no matter what, with our greatest security protector in the United States. I think the Trump administration and its egregious acts offers us an opportunity to rethink that view of security and to take a much more expansive view of security that takes in public health, that takes in climate action, that takes in economic equality, to broaden our understanding again of what makes us safer. And I think because of the Trump administration and what it is doing, there is the political space and the expectation on the part of the Australian community to do that, and that it exists in a way that it hasn't for a very long time. I think this is a really rare opportunity that Trump is giving us to collectively rethink our security and our safety, and to do that in an inclusive and actively democratic way.
Thanks for watching. If you'd like to keep up to date with all our latest research and work, sign up to our newsletter. Delivered every fortnight, it includes behind-the-scenes updates from Richard Dennis, an exclusive cartoon from Judy Horacek, details for our upcoming events and webinars, as well as explainers, graphs, and not to mention the latest cutting-edge research and analysis from the team here on the key issues that are facing Australia. Click the button on your screen to check it out.